They received leftovers, pig's feet, corn shucks, and foraged plants. Still, from nearly nothing, enslaved individuals created a culinary tradition that continues to nourish America. These weren't simply dinners, they represented survival. Each recipe held suffering, strength, and a narrative that most textbooks overlook. In this video, we're revealing 25 survival foods eaten by slaves on plantations. The overlooked meals that sustained people through one of history's bleakest periods and the concealed origins of foods still present on our plates. Stay tuned because some will surprise you. 1. Parched corn, toasted dried kernels. When severe hunger struck in the fields, a pot or fire for cooking wasn't always available. That's when parched corn proved essential. Enslaved individuals would roast dried kernels until they turned brown and developed flavor. It was easy to carry, it was satisfying, and it could remain fresh for weeks. Consider it their version of trail mix. Except it wasn't for outdoor adventures, it was for staying alive. Parched corn provided sufficient energy to endure exhausting labor. And occasionally, it was the only food a person consumed all day. Jump to the present and you'll notice its influence in kettle corn at carnivals or the roasted corn nuts available at convenience stores. But for plantation dwellers, this wasn't a treat. It was survival. And here's the surprising part. This basic survival food didn't just sustain people. It laid the foundation for Southern culinary traditions we still enjoy. But what occurred when the corn was depleted? The solution was another dish so basic, so minimal, it surprised even outside observers. 2. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn served as survival's portable food, then cornmeal mush was the warm meal that sustained folks at nightfall. Simply cornmeal, water, and salt, heated until it formed a dense porridge. No milk, no butter, none of the additions we include now. Just sufficient to ease an empty stomach. This dish appeared so frequently it showed up in slave accounts repeatedly. Sometimes it was served into wooden containers where children would huddle around with utensils, eating together like animals at a feeding trough. Harsh, degrading, but it sustained them. Here's what stands out. Mush wasn't only supper. Cold remains were cut and pan-fried the following day, becoming something similar to polenta patties. That clever extension, boiling once, frying afterward, multiplied the food quantity and rescued scraps that could have been lost. Jump to today, and you'll still notice its influence in Southern fried cornmeal patties or even Italian polenta fries on dining menus. But for the enslaved, mush represented survival reduced to basics, simple, heavy, and memorable. 3. Turnip greens stew. When meat portions were limited, and they nearly always were, enslaved households relied on the land directly. Turnip greens, those sharp leaves most people discarded, became essential to survival stews. Cooked until soft, flavored with nothing beyond a bit of salt, or perhaps a piece of pork fat if fortunate. This wasn't cozy food, it was sustenance food. But here's the reality. Greens provided more than calories. They supplied strength. They satisfied the stomach with warmth when winter cold penetrated flimsy clothing and bare shelters. A pot of turnip greens bubbling over a flame wasn't just nourishment. It was optimism extended into a meal. Eventually, that sharp, earthy taste became recognizable, even valued. Households shared methods to reduce the bitterness. Long cooking, combining with roots, incorporating whatever scraps they possessed. And that practice resonates strongly now. Enter a Southern kitchen and you'll still find pots of greens cooking, collards, mustards, or turnips seasoned and accompanied by cornbread. But for the enslaved, it began with survival, not flavor. A stew created from leaves, stems, and scraps most wouldn't consider. 4th, cowpea stew. Well before black-eyed peas became a New Year's custom, they were survival food on plantations. Enslaved Africans brought understanding of cowpeas across the Atlantic, resilient beans that thrived in southern warmth and inferior soil, inexpensive, satisfying, and rich in protein. They served as a lifeline when meat was merely a distant thought. Cowpea stew was straightforward. Simmer the beans until tender, season with a little salt, possibly add a piece of pork skin if available. Sometimes it cooked with foraged herbs or onions from the fields, but often it was simply beans and water, basic, substantial, and nourishing. But here's the meaningful detail. Cowpeas weren't merely survival food, they represented a connection to home. For numerous enslaved individuals, this was among the rare foods linking them to Africa, where cowpeas had been prepared for generations in stews and porridges. Consuming them wasn't just satisfying hunger, it was maintaining a fragment of identity in a world attempting to destroy it. And presently, that heritage lives on whenever black-eyed peas are prepared with rice or cooked into hoppin' john. What originated as a survival stew now symbolizes fortune, abundance, and Southern heritage. But survival wasn't always cultivated or raised. Sometimes it was gathered directly from the ground and boiled into something barely palatable. 5. Dandelion greens boiled soft. When you consider dandelions presently, you likely imagine yard weeds, something to eliminate or extract. But for enslaved households, those perceived weeds were nature's offering. Dandelion greens flourished naturally, required no cultivation, and filled pots when nothing remained. Cooked until soft, the greens shed some bitterness, though not entirely. Sometimes they received a touch of vinegar, maybe a small amount of fat, but typically just greens and water. A weak broth, a tough texture, and barely sufficient to reduce hunger. Here's the overlooked value. Dandelions contained nutrients, iron, vitamins, vitality. Even if plantation masters didn't recognize or acknowledge it, enslaved cooks realized these weeds exceeded mere filler. They served as survival nutrition, and this survival food didn't disappear. In southern regions, dandelion greens were consumed into the 1900s, and presently they've returned as a fashionable health food in upscale eateries and markets. Picture that. What once represented desperate measures now costs several dollars per bunch. But if sharp weeds could transform into a meal, consider what happened when the uncommon sweetness of sugar reached enslaved hands. 6. Molasses water, sweet ration drink. Sugar represented currency on plantations, and enslaved individuals seldom experienced it. But occasionally they'd receive a portion of molasses. Dense, dark, sticky. It wasn't confection, but it was sweet, and that sweetness held significance. The easiest way to preserve it, mix a spoonful into a metal cup of water. That became molasses water, a humble person's energy beverage. It provided quick calories, a touch of sweetness in an existence where taste was typically harsh. For youngsters, that cup was an uncommon pleasure. For grown-ups, it was fuel, sufficient to continue through another day working. Sometimes it served as remedy, too, combined with herbs to calm coughs or ease the stomach. What's remarkable is how this carries forward. Molasses water represented survival, but it also sparked southern sweets, barbecue glazes, and baked items we cherish currently. That sticky sweetness influenced the taste of an entire area. But if molasses was precious treasure, the following food was the reverse. Leftovers, so undesired that plantation masters discarded them. And yet, enslaved cooks converted them into a meal that still generates discussion. 7. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a privilege enslaved individuals almost never experienced unless it was the portions nobody desired. That's when salt pork scraps mattered. Plantation masters retained the hams, cuts, and roasts. while the fat pieces, skin and scraps, went to the slave living areas. Pan-fried, those scraps released fat that flavored everything from beans to greens. Simmered, they became chewy portions in a stew pot. And when no meat remained, just the fat enslaved cooks preserved every bit, extending it to season cornmeal, mush, or sharp greens. Here's the difficult reality. Salt pork was never intended as generosity. It was cheap, preserved, and deemed unsuitable for respectable dining. But through the hands of enslaved individuals, it became essential to survival cooking. That briny, smoky taste enhanced complete meals, making scraps seem like abundance. And the heritage, you can still experience it now. Southern soul food, from collard greens cooked with ham hock to pan-fried cabbage with bacon, connects to those scraps. What was once rejected has become comfort. But meat scraps weren't the sole thing enslaved cooks transformed. When gardens and fields thinned, they utilized pumpkins and wild greens, cooking them into a survival stew that nourished whole families. 8. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When food supplies dwindled, enslaved cooks needed creativity with whatever the earth provided. Pumpkins growing naturally in patches and sharp greens from the fields frequently combined in one pot. The outcome was a pottage, a basic stew that emphasized survival over enjoyment. Pumpkin pieces provided sweetness and thickness, while the greens, rigid, sharp, and fibrous, bulked up the pot. Sometimes, everything cooked with only water and salt. Other times, if fortune appeared, a piece of pork fat or random onion enhanced flavor. Nothing wasted, nothing elaborate, but collectively it created enough to distribute. Here's the point. This wasn't merely food, it was survival transformation, acquiring the bland, the sharp, and the rejected, and converting them into something warm and satisfying. That style of cooking demonstrated resourcefulness, demonstrated perseverance, and the influence still remains. You can observe it currently in southern pumpkin broths, autumn stews, even how greens get prepared slowly until they soften into comfort. What started as a humble person's pottage has become essential to seasonal cooking. But pumpkins contained another benefit too, not merely the flesh, but the seeds. Roasted, salted, and consumed by handfuls, they were the snack that sustained people through the most difficult times. 9. Roasted pumpkin seeds. After the pumpkin flesh entered the pot, nothing was discarded, not even the seeds. Enslaved households would rinse them, dry them, and roast them over burning coals with a bit of salt if obtainable. The seeds became an uncommon, crispy snack. They weren't just flavorful. Pumpkin seeds contained protein and fat, elements that were limited in a diet consisting mainly of grains and greens. For youngsters, particularly, a handful of roasted seeds could distinguish between sleeping, starving, and resting with some comfort. Here's what makes it significant. This was survival food created from waste. What most plantation kitchens removed and threw away, enslaved cooks converted into something beneficial, even pleasant. That instinct to preserve, to extend, to create something from nothing characterized survival, and it's a practice that persisted. Presently, roasted pumpkin seeds appear in snack packages at stores, scattered over salads, even marketed as health foods. What once represented desperate food now sells commercially. But while seeds could be roasted into a pleasure, the turnip root provided another survival form. Roasted gradually until it became soft enough to replace bread or meat. 10. Turnip root roast. When bread was a privilege and meat was fantasy, the simple turnip root became the alternative. Extracted directly from soil, cleaned, and roasted in fire ashes, it changed from hard and sharp into something tender, earthy, and slightly sweet. Enslaved households treated roasted turnips as filling food, something to quiet hunger when cornmeal was depleted. Sometimes it was consumed plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thin and fried in pork fat if scraps existed. A humble person's potato, a survival person's bread. But here's the notable aspect. Roasting revealed a depth that made it almost seem like a pleasure. Picture the scent of a smoky flame, the root darkened outside, steaming inside. It wasn't just nourishment, it was warmth, something you could grasp in your hands during a cold evening. And this method didn't disappear. Roasted root vegetables entered southern kitchens, church gatherings, and even celebration tables. What began as survival cooking established a lasting position in American culinary traditions. But if the turnip root satisfied stomachs, the following dish, a blend of corn and okra, contained flavors connecting enslaved Africans directly to their ancestry. 11. Okra and corn mash. Okra wasn't originally American. It arrived on slave vessels, preserved in memory and in seeds concealed in fabric. On plantations, it flourished in southern warmth, and enslaved cooks combined it with the one crop always present, corn. The outcome was okra and corn mash, a dish that was basic, satisfying, and connected directly to Africa. The mash was typically just okra pods, cut thin, cooked down with ground corn or grits until it formed a dense, sticky stew. Sometimes slippery, sometimes grainy, but always sufficient to satisfy a stomach. When pork scraps or onion were around, they'd be added for taste. But most evenings, it was simply the two basics, corn and okra. Here's the fuller narrative. Every portion of this dish represented survival, yes, but it also represented cultural memory. Okra stews and corn porridges were already components of African meals long before slavery. So when enslaved households combined them in America, they weren't just eating, they were maintaining a fragment of their identity. And you still observe it presently. Gumbo, succotash, and southern okra dishes all connect to that mash. What originated as survival in slave-living areas became flavor integrated into the South's character. But when food didn't flourish in fields or gardens, survival sometimes required pursuing it in the wilderness, like the sweet fruit of the persimmon tree. 12. Foraged persimmons, mashed or eaten raw. Sweetness was uncommon on the plantation table, which made persimmons seem like treasure. Growing naturally in southern forests and fields, these small orange fruits appeared harmless, but bite into one before ripeness, and your mouth puckered from the sharp astringency. Wait until the frost arrived, though, and that identical fruit became soft, sweet, and golden. Enslaved households understood the technique. They gathered persimmons late in the season, consuming them raw or mashing them into pulp. Sometimes the mash was dried into thin cakes, transported as pocket food for extended field days. Other times it was mixed into water to create a type of sweet beverage like nature's version of molasses. Persimmons weren't just about taste. They were about fortune, timing, and land understanding. Knowing when to gather them, how to prepare them, and how to extend them distinguished between a sharp mistake and an uncommon moment of sweetness in an otherwise difficult existence, and persimmons never vanished. You can still locate them in southern backyards, converted into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What was once a foraged survival fruit became a concealed treasure of southern cooking. But fruit wasn't always abundant. More frequently, survival required accepting broken grains, the discarded fragments of rice that planters deemed worthless. 13. Broken rice porridge, Carolina middlings. On Carolina plantations, rice was dominant, but enslaved households almost never experienced the refined, polished grains that enriched planters. What they received instead were the middlings, broken fragments of rice remaining after processing. To the masters, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was survival. Those fragments were cooked into a thin porridge, sometimes salted, sometimes combined with scraps of beans or greens, but typically just rice and water. It wasn't elaborate, it wasn't satisfying for long, but it was fuel for another workday. Here's the notable aspect. Enslaved Africans already possessed deep understanding of rice cultivation and preparation from their homelands. They knew how to extract flavor and sustenance from even the broken grains. And through that, they maintained not just their bodies, but their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. And eventually, the concept of extending humble rice into soups, porridges, and stews became essential to Southern kitchens. Even presently, dishes like rice gruel or congee-style porridges reflect that identical survival method. But when rice was gone, enslaved households turned to what the forests provided them: wild fruits that attached to vines and colored fingers purple. 14 wild muscadine grapes. Deep in southern forests, tangled vines provided a secret offering: muscadine grapes, thick-skinned, filled with juice. These wild grapes weren't the neat, seedless variety you observe in markets. Presently, they were messy, tart, and sometimes sweet enough to seem like a blessing. For enslaved households, muscadines were an uncommon experience of plenty. Children gathered them, coloring their hands and mouths purple, while grown-ups mashed them into pulps or cooked them for juice. If sufficient were collected, the fruit could even be maintained into syrups, a method to extend the sweetness into the scarce months. Here's the fuller significance. Muscadines weren't just nourishment, they were independence food. They flourished outside the plantation's authority in forests and thickets, ready for gathering if you knew locations. Locating them was a minor act of autonomy, a reminder that the earth still provided offerings even in the most difficult times, and muscadines never departed southern existence. Presently, they're converted into jellies, wines, and juices, valued as a native fruit. What once prevented hunger now sits bottled on store shelves. But the following food was no earth offering. It originated from the slaughterhouse, a portion so undesired most wouldn't consider it. The tongue of a cow. 15 boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the finest beef cuts never arrived at the slave living areas. But when a cow was slaughtered, portions like the tongue, rigid, fatty, and deemed undesirable, sometimes did enslaved cooks wasted nothing, and boiled cow tongue became both survival and creativity. The preparation was simple. The tongue was cleaned, cooked for hours until tender, and then sliced thin. Sometimes a bit of salt or a touch of vinegar provided flavor, but typically it was consumed as it was, chewy, substantial, and satisfying. Here's the reality. Tongue wasn't merely a scrap. It was an uncommon source of genuine protein and fat in a diet that relied heavily on grains and greens. For households accustomed to extending vegetables and corn into meals, having actual meat, even from the tongue, seemed like a triumph. And what's intriguing is how that scrap changed eventually. Presently, beef tongue is a specialty in cuisines globally, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What the enslaved once consumed from necessity is now featured on menus at premium prices. But when meat like this was uncommon, survival required returning to the grind, literally with cracked corn cooked into plain grits. 16 cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never vanished from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground fine, it became mush. Left in larger fragments, it became grits. Enslaved households cooked cracked corn in water until it expanded and softened into a dense plain porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. This dish was satisfying, but it wasn't luxury. It was survival fuel, substantial enough to quiet the stomach, basic enough to prepare in one pot, and cheap enough to always be available. Day after day, grits appeared at the table somehow, morning or evening. Here's the aspect that resonates. Even though it was plain, grits became a basis of Southern cooking. Eventually, with flavoring milk or gravy, they changed from survival food into comfort food. But in the slave-living areas, plain grits were frequently the first portion of the day, and sometimes the sole one. It's a reminder of how basics persist. Presently, grits are enhanced with shrimp in upscale eateries or covered with cheese at diners. But their origin narrative is far grimmer, a bowl of cracked corn maintaining bodies alive under impossible circumstances. And while grits warmed the body, enslaved households also utilized the forests for warmth another way, brewing the roots of sassafras trees into a survival tea. 17. Sassafras root tea. When water alone became dull, enslaved households turned to the forests for taste. The root of the sassafras tree, extracted from the earth and cooked, created a tea unlike anything else, earthy, aromatic, with a touch of sweetness. Long before root beer was ever bottled, sassafras root tea was a survival beverage. It wasn't just about flavor. Sassafras was considered to have medicinal properties. A warm cup of the tea calmed coughs, reduced fevers, and provided comfort when no genuine medicine existed. For people forced to labor sunrise to sunset with minimal rest, that mattered. Here's the notable aspect. Enslaved cooks weren't simply brewing roots from desperation. They possessed herbal understanding from Africa and acquired new ones from Native Americans, combining traditions to survive. Sassafras became beyond a beverage. It was resilience in a cup. And this survival tea created a lasting impression. Centuries afterward, its taste inspired root beer, a beverage now enjoyed globally, but its beginning wasn't sweet soda and chilled mugs. It was enslaved households, gathered by firelight, consuming warmth from a root extracted from the ground. But not everything from the earth was brewed or cooked. Some foods were maintained, like cucumbers and peppers, placed into brine to last through scarce months. 18. Pickled cucumbers and peppers, brine preserve. Fresh food never lasted long in the slave-living areas, so preserving became a method to extend the harvest. With just salt, water, and time, enslaved cooks converted cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could remain for weeks. The method was basic. Cut the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour over brine. After sitting several days, the crunch softened, but the taste grew strong, sour, salty, sometimes even spicy if peppers were utilized. For households consuming plain corn mush or sharp greens, a pickle alongside was a flavor burst that made survival meals tolerable. Pickling wasn't just about flavor, though. It was about safety. When gardens and fields ceased producing, those jars of maintained vegetables indicated there was still something to rely on. A sour portion in the middle of winter could distinguish between another day of strength and the edge of hunger. And the heritage, Southern kitchens never released it. Chow chow, pepper relish, bread and butter pickles all connect to those first brine jars on the plantation. What originated as necessity became custom. But not every survival food originated from the garden. Sometimes it required cracking open the most difficult offerings of the forest, like black walnuts, sharp and stubborn, but worth the work. 19. Foraged black walnuts. If you've ever cracked open a black walnut, you understand it's no simple task. The shells are dense, the stain penetrates into your hands, and the nut meat conceals deep inside. But for enslaved households, black walnuts were worth every strike of a stone or hammer. Collected from the forest floor, the nuts were valued for their richness. Once cracked, the kernels provided protein, fat, and a taste far stronger than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were consumed raw, other times chopped and mixed into porridge or utilized to extend a basic dessert when molasses was available. Here's the fuller reality. Black walnuts weren't just nourishment, they were survival treasure. Every nut cracked indicated energy stored, a minor triumph against hunger. Households would preserve them for scarce months or transport them into the fields for quick strength. And eventually, their heritage expanded. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, even old-fashioned candies, all originate from a food enslaved individuals first gathered from necessity. What the earth provided as hardship, they converted into nourishment. But when nuts and fruit weren't around, survival required scraping from the garden's core itself, cooking down cabbage hearts and stems that others would have discarded. 20. Stewed cabbage cores. On the plantation, the fresh outer leaves of cabbage might arrive at the master's table, but the rigid woody cores, those were thrown aside. In the slave-living areas, though, cabbage cores weren't waste. They were cooked down, softened, and changed into survival stew. The cores were chopped and cooked for hours until the fibers yielded. Sometimes they received a bit of salt, or if fortune blessed, a piece of pork fat. More frequently, it was just cabbage and water, thin, bland, but sufficient to place something warm in an empty stomach. Here's what's significant. Enslaved households had no space for waste. What others rejected, they discovered a method to consume. Those cabbage cores filled the pot and extended meals slightly further. And in a world where every calorie mattered, even the scraps held importance. And this resourcefulness created an impression. Southern kitchens to this day contain recipes that utilized the complete vegetable, stewed cabbage, braised stalks, even pickled stems. What started as desperation cooking became part of the area's food character. But not every preservation was so simple. Sometimes survival arrived with spice, like green tomato chow chow, a tangy relish that enhanced bite to otherwise bland meals. 21. Green tomato chow chow relish. When harvest concluded and tomatoes were remaining hanging green on the vine, enslaved cooks refused to let them waste. They chopped those unripe tomatoes, combined them with peppers, onions, vinegar, and salt, then cooked it all into a sharp relish called chow chow. It was vibrant, tangy, and slightly spicy, the type of taste that could cut through the heaviness of beans, corn mush, or cooked greens. A spoonful alongside turned plain survival food into something that actually awakened the taste buds. And in a world where meals were typically sharp or bland, that mattered more than most understood. But here's the larger picture. Chow chow wasn't just about taste, it was preservation. By pickling and spicing what couldn't ripen, enslaved households extended food into the cold months when gardens went empty. It was a survival approach concealed in a relish jar, and its heritage still shines presently. Southern tables, from barbecue establishments to Sunday meals, serve chow chow alongside meats, beans, and cornbread. What originated as a method to preserve scraps has become a Southern custom with origins deep in the slave-living areas. But when vegetables weren't sufficient, people turned to the earth again, this time roasting roots to make a sharp beverage that replaced coffee. 22. Chicory coffee, roasted chicory brew. Coffee was a privilege reserved for the big house. But in the slave-living areas, enslaved households discovered their own replacement. They extracted the roots of the chicory plant, roasted them dark, and ground them into a rough powder. When prepared with hot water, it created a sharp, smoky beverage that appeared and felt like coffee, even if it wasn't. For numerous people, chicory brew wasn't just about flavor, it was about practice. Having something warm to consume at dawn before the fields or late at evening when the body hurt, it provided comfort a minor piece of dignity, and sometimes even fooled the mind into believing it was genuine. Here's the detail. Chicory didn't disappear when slavery concluded in New Orleans. Particularly, it became a custom. Even presently, famous cafes blend chicory with coffee, serving a beverage that connects to the creativity of enslaved individuals making do with what they possessed. So, while the masters consumed imported beans, the enslaved drank roasted roots. Both cups were hot. Both held significance. But only one was created from survival. And when even roots couldn't satisfy hunger, enslaved cooks turned to the minimal scraps, bones thrown aside, cooking them down into broths that sustained families through famine. 23. Scrap bone broth. When the meat was depleted, when even the fat and scraps were picked clean, there was still one thing remaining: the bones. Plantation kitchens discarded them, but in the slave-living areas, nothing was wasted. Enslaved households collected those rejected bones, placed them in a pot of water, and cooked them for hours. The outcome was scrap bone broth, thin, oily, but rich with whatever nutrients the marrow could provide. It wasn't hearty stew. Typically, there was no meat remaining on the bone, but slowly cooking them extracted flavor, strength, and barely enough fat to extend plain corn mush or greens. For youngsters and the ill, that broth could distinguish between weakness and another workday. Here's the concealed reality. Bone broth presently is marketed as a health trend, bottled, branded, and costly. But its origins trace to survival cooking in slave-living areas where it was never about wellness movements. It was about staying alive with bones stripped clean. Survival frequently turned to the fields again, this time to the simplest harvest of all, fresh green corn roasted in its husk over open flames. 24. Roasted green corn in husk. In late summer, when the corn was still tender and green on the stalk, enslaved households would slip into the fields and pull several ears. The easiest method to consume it was to throw the complete thing, husk and all, onto hot coals. After several minutes, the husk darkened, the kernel steamed, and roasted green corn was ready. The taste was smoky, sweet, and satisfying. An uncommon pleasure that needed no pot, no flavoring, no meat scraps, just fire and patience. Youngsters particularly enjoyed it, consuming down to the cob, relishing every portion. For grown-ups, it was quick fuel after exhausting days, a method to enjoy the harvest before the fields were gathered clean for the plantation. Here's the notable aspect. Roasted corn wasn't just survival, it was happiness. Among the rare moments when food seemed like an offering instead of a ration, assembled around the flame, husks in hand, enslaved households discovered a minor experience of independence in the simplest of foods, and that custom carried forward. Presently, roasted corn appears at fairs, festivals, and backyard cookouts across America. What once indicated endurance now indicates celebration. But the final dish on this survival list brings us to the wilderness. A thin, sharp broth made from onions and garlic extracted directly from the earth. 25. Wild onion and garlic soup, thin broth. Out in the fields and forests, enslaved households gathered not just for greens and fruit, but for the sharp taste of wild onions and garlic. These hardy plants flourished along ditches and forest edges, and when cooked into water, they created a thin, strong soup. It wasn't hearty. Typically, it was just broth, clear, light, and flavored only by those wild bulbs. But in an existence of constant hunger, even that thin soup held power. The sulfur-rich plants helped combat sickness, cleared the chest, and provided a sense of warmth when stomachs were otherwise empty. Youngsters might consume it like medicine, while grown-ups drank it to continue through long evenings, and when scraps of salt pork or fat were added, if any could be spared, the soup changed into something closer to a genuine meal. Here's the heritage. Presently, onions and garlic are the foundation of nearly every cuisine globally. But for the enslaved, their wild relatives weren't just taste. They were survival, a sharp broth that sustained bodies through the most difficult days. And with that, we reach full circle. From roasted corn to sharp greens, from scrap bones to wild herbs, every dish conveys the identical narrative survival created from struggle and a culinary culture that still resonates in Southern kitchens today.